In 2006, the World Wildlife Fund declared Cuba to be the only country in the world that had achieved sustainability. Their definition of sustainability is that Cuba has given its citizens a reasonable quality of life while still protecting the ecosystem and ensuring that the environment, both human and ecological, stays healthy now and far into the future. There are many countries where people have more consumer goods and trappings of wealth than does the average Cuban. In many of these societies, the ecosystem is being degraded and destroyed daily by the rapaciousness of polluting industries that contaminate the air and defile the groundwater. The World Wildlife Fund's criteria for sustainability has a number of defined measurements. The well-being of the people is one aspect. The revolution brought free healthcare, free education, free school uniforms, free childcare, subsidized food, electricity, and gas, even free tickets to the theater. 85% of the people own their own homes, and the government subsidizes the rent of the other 15%. These social advantages are one part of sustainability. In 1958, Cuba was a country filled with corruption. 2/3 of arable land was owned by American citizens. American companies ran everything: oil refineries, sugar factories, mines, telephone companies, banks, electric companies. You name it, U.S. interests owned it. The Cuban people were the vassals. These companies had no interest in protecting the ecosystem or the people. They plundered Cuba. At that time, there were two Cubas: the urban Cuba, that was relatively well off, and the rural one, in which hunger was rampant for much of the year. There was the rich Cuba, in which 75% of the land was owned by 8% of the people, many of them foreign. This was the Cuba that partied from dawn to dusk, while 66% of rural families lived in huts with dirt floors and no running water. Fidel Castro viewed this poverty firsthand. He grew up on a sugar plantation and saw how destitute many of the laborers were. Fidel never forgot the hardship he had witnessed in his youth. After the revolution, Fidel turned his immediate attention to the agriculture sector. Sugarcane made up 2/3 of Cuba's exports. Industrial farmers controlled huge plantations devoted to this crop. To create these enormous farms, they had slashed and burned the forests and displaced the original small farmers, who either moved to less fertile areas or became tenants on these estates. Fidel Castro was appalled by the conditions of the people in rural Cuba. There was only one sugarcane crop per year. People were paid for 4 months' work only. For the other 8 months, they lived in desperation, hungry, penniless, and miserable. There were no medical services in the rural areas. Graveyards were filled with people who died because they had no access to health care. In 1960, Fidel nationalized many foreign businesses, including the entire sugarcane industry, and distributed 150,000 deeds to landless farmers. The U.S. government, in retaliation, greatly reduced the amount of sugar that it imported. It also enacted an embargo on all exports to Cuba. As a result, Cuba turned to the USSR, that bought sugar at a very favorable rate and sold products to Cuba in return. The workers' situations improved because they were employed for the entire year. The decision on the part of the Cuban government to ally with the Russian Empire had many ramifications. In the short term, it was a saving grace. The whole economy would have collapsed without a replacement for the U.S. But in the long term, the USSR bought only a few items from Cuba, sugar being the main export. Cuba, therefore, did not diversify as it should have to become self-sustaining. From its dependency on the U.S., it moved to a reliance on the USSR. This dependency failed Cuba in the long run. Those Cubans who are old enough to remember still have nightmares about the special period in the early 90s when the Soviet Union imploded. Most of Cuba's imports had come from Russia: machinery, food, oil, medicines, fertilizer, spare parts, insecticides, farm machinery. This trade relationship came to a brutal halt when the USSR fell apart. There was no longer a Soviet Union, and no other country stepped in to take its place. The lack of oil left Cuba hemorrhaging. Farm equipment ran out of gas. Farmers ran out of fertilizer, insecticide, and spare parts. Electric generators stopped working. Buses, trucks, and private vehicles stopped running. Factories stopped producing. Leaders brainstormed to find solutions and turned to experts in sustainable agriculture. Cuba had to diversify its crops. It had to find substitutes for fertilizer and insecticides. It had to grow food locally. First of all, Cuba decentralized the huge bureaucratic state farms that were run on the Soviet model and distributed small parcels to farmers. Most agricultural decisions became localized. Cooperatives in which farmers shared their tools, knowledge, and paperwork were encouraged. The government loosened its laws on self-employment, creating a whole new group of entrepreneurs who sold their vegetables and fruits to their neighbors, their friends, in cooperatives and on the streets. This model motivated the farmers and made their labors much more efficient.
Es una rumba flamenca que todos pueden bailar. La rumba de la roqueta se baila sin descansar. Es una rumba flamenca que todos pueden bailar. Bailará, 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 solo por ti bailará, bailará, solo por ti bailará.
With the help of the government, city dwellers also became farmers. On every empty lot, terrace, roof, balcony, and windowsill, people began growing food. Some of these urban farms were tiny, just a few square feet in diameter. Some were much larger, 3 or 4 acres. The government supported the newly minted urban farmers as well as rural farmers by supplying teachers and workshops in organic farming. Cubans learned how to replace chemical with natural fertilizers. They learned to do without chemical insecticides, farm machinery, buses, and trucks. Natural and sustainable methods of farming spread throughout the whole country. For transportation, the government imported 700,000 bicycles, and in the worst part of the special period, family members would ride miles into the country to get food. Teams of oxen, horses, and mules supplanted plows and trucks and provided natural fertilizer. Soon there were crops of tomatoes, bananas, beans, and anything else that would grow. By 1995, the food shortage was over. 1996 brought in a bumper crop. But the government did not turn away from organic and urban farming. Cuba still leads the world in these endeavors. One result of organic farming is a much better environment. Under the Soviets, Cuba had used big farm equipment, lots of gas and oil, chemical fertilizers, and insecticides. The runoff from such methods poisoned the ecosystem, killed the animals and birds, and polluted the groundwater. This environmental degradation stopped once organic farming became the norm. Environmentalism in Cuba, however, goes much beyond organic farming. The Cuban lifestyle is good for the environment. Cubans use and reuse everything. They don't have the means to buy many consumer products, and so there are few cars, few machines, no fast food restaurants, no supermarkets, no throwaway plastic bags, no empty water bottles strewn on the ground, none of the wasteful products that we in our consumer economy use every day to the detriment of the environment. Even before the special period brought about change in Cuba, the government supported environmentalism as an economic engine. In 1959, much land in Cuba was entirely degraded. Deforested, dry, and barren, devoid of topsoil, the lands were home to few, and those dwelling there were poor, desperate souls. By 1968, the government decided to restore these lands by initiating a green revolution. One of the government's first projects occurred in the mountainous region of Sierra del Rosario. On the denuded, sandy, mountainous landscape, the first step after building access roads was to construct terraces to protect against continued erosion. Next was reforestation. Trees of all types were planted: cedar, mahogany, papaya, avocado, grapefruit, red ginger mariposa, royal palms, teak orange, hibiscus, and many more. 8 million in all. Next came the village. Homes, schools, artists' studios, workshops, clinics, and playgrounds were constructed. As a result of this work, Las Terrazas, as this new town was called, became a most desirable place to live. Today, there is a long waiting list to become one of the 1,000 people residing there. When the special period occurred, to get more cash in foreign exchange, the government encouraged the residents to open their town to tourism and to become entirely self-sustaining. Now, Las Terrazas grows 70% of its own food, and the other 25% comes from within 17 miles. There is also a very special eco-hotel, La Mocha, about 9 cafes and restaurants, a museum, and many artist studios. 90% of the residents work with tourists.
La rumba de la roqueta se baila sin descansar. Es una rumba flamenca que todos pueden bailar. La rumba de la roqueta se baila sin descansar. Es una rumba flamenca que todos pueden bailar. Bailará, 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 solo por ti bailará, bailará, solo por ti bailará, bailará, solo por ti bailará.
The government supports conservation. 22% of all land in Cuba is under some form of protection. This is among the highest of any nation. Cuba has the largest parcels of intact rain and mangrove forests, national parks, organic farms, wetlands, fertile soil, pristine beaches, and thriving coral reefs in the Caribbean. 3,500 miles of coastline is undeveloped. Under Castro, the amount of forested land increased from 14% to 21%. To maintain the environment, the government designated 104 protected marine areas. In addition, there are 6 United Nations Biosphere Reserves, 9 United Nations World Heritage Sites, 6 Ramsar Conservation Sites, and 14 national parks. The Biosphere Park Ciénago de Zapata alone covers 1.5 million acres. It is the size of Delaware. Imagine. Cuba itself is approximately the size of Pennsylvania, and within Cuba is one park the size of Delaware. And there are many additional parks as well. Only 9,000 people live in Zapata, which is 60 to 70% undeveloped. The lucky inhabitants are not only the human residents, but the undisturbed fish, birds, reptiles, and plants. It is Cuba's largest protected area and one of the most important ones in the whole Caribbean. The first national park established by the revolutionary government is Desembarco del Granma National Park. It is now a United Nations Heritage Site. This is where Castro and his men got off the yacht Granma when they returned from Mexico to start the revolution. It is about 100 miles square and includes a spectacularly beautiful landscape. Its sea cliffs are of various colors, shapes, and textures, and are resplendent and regal as the tides wash in and out at their bases. The waterfalls splashing over the cliffs create sensuous harmonies. Granma is a place of splendor. What better monument to the success of the revolution could there be than this lovely park? For a small archipelago, Cuba has a very diverse environment. Most of its 11 million inhabitants live on the coastal plain, 2 million in Havana alone. The island is largely limestone, a very soft stone that erodes easily. For this reason, there are over 20,000 caves on the island. There are also limestone mountains called magotes that rise perpendicularly from richly cultivated fields in the Vinales Valley. Their shapes vary, but they are all extremely steep. They look barren, but tiny snails cling to their precipitous walls. These mountains decorate the landscape with their diverse shapes. Some have summits shaped like gentle curves. Some are entirely flat. Some look like chimneys, while others look like walls. There are 3 mountain ranges in Cuba, the highest being Pico Turquino in the Sierra Maestras, about 6,500 feet high. The mountains offer some great hiking with their rich rainforests, ascending paths, gorges, steep cliffs, and dramatic vistas. Many are densely wooded and offer great habitats to the resident birds and animals. Tourists in Cuba today see for themselves the result of all the environmental policies of the Cuban government and people. A solitary beach, the water murmuring as it caresses the shore, striated bands of sand glowing on the ocean's floor, the sun shining brightly on the water's shimmering surface, waves showering the rocks with white foam. Some birds and animals hide in the hollows of dead trees. Some bask in the sun at the tip-top of the green branches. There are so many endemic animals and plants that are found nowhere else on Earth. The national bird, the Cuban trogon, is shrouded in a green niche. Its bright reds, blues, whites, and greens barely visible. The bee hummingbird, the smallest bird in the world about the size of a bee, spins around looking for nectar in his favorite flowering vine. The pygmy owl, the smallest owl in the world, peeks out from his leafy bower. The reefs teem with colorful fish. The swamps harbor manatees and Cuban crocodiles. This is a special Cuban species that can leap up and grab an unsuspecting animal lounging on a branch above the lake and make a quick meal of it. There are over 4,000 islands in the Cuban archipelago. Some are tiny sandy patches formed on the top of coral. Some are larger and some are connected to the mainland by causeways. Sometimes the views from the bridges are rich with birds. Huge flocks of flamingos, herons, or pelicans. There are mangrove swamps nearby, breeding grounds for over 750 species. The mountain forests are rich with trees and plants that provide refuge to birds and animals. There are between 6,000 and 7,500 species of plants, half of which are endemic. There are 90 different types of palm trees alone, the cork palm being the most exotic and dating back to the dinosaurs. The royal palm, with its graceful beauty, is the national tree of Cuba. Aside from the elegance of the Cuban landscape is the exquisite loveliness of its people. Men and women walk hand in hand on the Malecon. Flirting and laughing, they gently lean against one another. When a huge wave surges over the seawall, there is a serenade of lively shrieks. A band exuberantly plays energetic music outside a cafe. The musicians smiling, swaying, and dancing to their own beats. There is music everywhere in restaurants, cafes, hotels, and on street corners. Live music swells through the air with its mesmerizing Latin beat. Two friends suddenly meet, a chance encounter on the sidewalk, full of warmth and affection, full of community spirit and recognition. A farmer proudly displays his drying tobacco crop. A teacher with concern and empathy displayed on her face helps a struggling student. A doctor takes special care of a disabled child, making sure that all vaccines are up to date. These are the Cuban people, unaffected, sweet-natured, and caring, filled with love of family and community. They take part in the sustainable environment through their ability to find pleasure and happiness without using too many of the Earth's resources. This is an untouched environment. This is what could be mutilated in the hungry embrace of capitalists, industrialists, and tycoons. This is the Cuba that the revolution, the embargo, and isolation have preserved. This is the Cuba that must be shielded from a greed-obsessed world, a place where money trumps all other values. Capitalists, being capitalists, will not protect the environment unless the rules are tight and the punishments are great. After 50 years of deprivation, Cubans are waiting to get their hands on stuff, all the stuff Americans have. Liana Nunes Velas, an environmentalist, warns that the Cuban people are hungry for things. There will be an internal tsunami in which the people will demand consumption, 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 and profit, profit. Raul Castro has introduced many reforms, and his main idea is to decentralize only up to the point where control is not lost, and centralize only up to the point where initiative is not killed. In other words, keep the revolution but loosen up so that workers are more motivated, creativity is unleashed, and Cuba's halting economy makes strides for its people. Can all of that happen? Can an increase of tourism be reconciled with protecting a pure environment? At this juncture in history, Cuba is under great pressure to modernize. Lurking in these demands for globalization are environmental destruction and unfettered capitalism. Many plutocrats are waiting in the wings to make a killing with little regard for the land and the people of Cuba. The air could become leaden with pollutants. The runoff from its streets and farms could destroy its reefs and decimate its wildlife. The wealth of the country might pour into the coffers of the 1%. The revolution would be over. Cuba might then look like Haiti, a grim, desolate moonscape. That would be a tragedy for Cuba and a tragedy for the world. If, on the other hand, a strong leader replaces Raul Castro, one who believes in the environment and the revolution, but also addresses the needs of the people for more worldly goods and manages to hold the rapacious plutocrats at bay, Cuba can remain the exquisite place that it is. Let us hope that the Cuban people are respectful of their heritage and do not get sidetracked by greed. This will preserve the simplicity and beauty of Cuba.
Sin descansar, es una rumba flamenca que todos pueden bailar. La rumba de la roqueta se baila sin descansar, es una rumba flamenca que todos pueden bailar. Bailará, 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 solo por ti bailará, bailará, solo por ti bailará, bailará, solo por ti bailará. Bailará, 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 solo por ti bailará, bailará, solo por ti bailará, bailará, solo por ti bailará. Se le enseña una señal.